There are several stages in life when you know you have reached adulthood. Many of us recently encountered one, when we were eligible to vote last November. It is a great feeling to have an input on our country's democracy. Some of us might have cheered about the results of the elections, while others of us might have been upset. However, there is an important voter issue that needs to be addressed and needs our input. Voter fraud. If you were like me, for the first time you heard this, you thought, who cares? Well, as a U.S. citizen, you should. What is the big deal about voter ID laws? Well, the big deal is that it prevents fraud and protects our country. According to the Rhode Island State Representative, Anastasia Williams arrived at her polling place in 2006 ready to vote, only to be told that she had already voted. This wasn't the only experience Miss Williams has had with voter fraud. 4 years later, she witnessed a man vote, then return to the polls again in different clothes and vote a second time. It is instances like this that proves we need to show an ID when voting. I want a law that requires voters to need special IDs to maintain voting integrity. For my first point, I would like to discuss the voter IDs, how a voter ID eliminates illegal immigrants from voting. In Arizona, they do not need to prove citizenship to vote. That creates an opportunity for illegal immigrants to vote illegally in the U.S. This is not acceptable because illegal votes have a possibility of overturning the election. This is why I feel American voters should have to show an ID before they vote. Also, a majority of voters say that they should have ballots printed only in English. That would also reduce the illegal immigrants from voting. This is why I want to urge voters to support the law and show an ID to eliminate illegal immigrants from voting in the U.S. One of the largest groups of immigrants are Hispanics. They are in favor of the voter ID law because it takes the pressure off of them to prove citizenship at the polls. According to an October survey by the Pew Hispanic Center, 97% of all registered Hispanic voters say that they are confident that they have voter identification that they will need to vote on the election day if voter ID laws are enforced. In fact, 71% of all registered Hispanic voters support voter identification laws. According to Marlon Paz, the former president of the Hispanic Bar of the District of Columbia, in October of 2012, the article of the Washington Times stated that the growing Hispanic population in our country plays a significant role on the election. Once votes were cast, it was of great importance to the Hispanic community that they can be confident their votes were cast fairly so that no one would question the legitimacy of their votes. This will benefit all Americans and especially help the Hispanics feel confident in voter honesty. Voter ID prevents immigrants from voting illegally and empowers Hispanic voters to feel confident in their voice being heard. Now that I have discussed one of the reasons why I vote for voter ID laws, I will move on to my second point: voter ID prevents fraud. By not showing any type of ID while voting, the chances of people committing fraud goes up. Voting fraud is a crime and can be prevented by showing any form of ID. According to the NE News Now, the article "Voter ID Laws Need to Prevent Fraud This Fall" explains that there have been several cases of fraud that have changed the outcome of the election, including in 2008 Senate race between Democratic Al Franken and the Republican Norm Coleman. Al Franken was the winner by 312 votes. A spokesman recalls, now that we know almost 1,100 felons voted legally in this election. That's 3 times the margin of victory. Was that an important race? Well, Al Franken provided the 60th vote that got Obamacare passed. Also, the Daily Caller has an article titled GOP group dismisses study saying that fraud cases infinitesimal. A group of journalists found just 2,068 cases of voter fraud across all 50 states since the year 2000, and none of them were convicted. There were only 10 cases of voter impersonation that were actually caught. Now we could prevent this by showing a form of voter ID. When we show a form of ID, we can cut fraud in the United States. From my examples of these two cases, we can see how voter ID at the polls would stop voter fraud and ensure that we are electing the true majority candidate. My third and final point for voter ID would be how the implementation of different types of IDs can make it convenient and hassle-free for all Americans to vote. The examples of other types of IDs are covered in an article in the Michigan Law Review titled Voter Identification. Affidavits, indelible ink marks, and signature comparison are just a few examples that the article lists. Affidavit is essentially a sworn oath like in court. Having an affidavit notarized provides more credibility. Indelible ink is used in many countries all over the world. Signature comparison is a simple way to ensure that voters are whom he or she says. Using the DMV database in conjunction with the software that banks and pharmacies use would allow quick, easy verification of signature comparison. If you forget your ID, there are a list of ID types on the Pennsylvania NAACP website. Some of the other IDs needed to obtain an alternate form of ID are a school ID, a W-2, a utility bill, and a social security card are just a few of the examples of the things needed to obtain an alternate ID. It seems that we need to show proof of ID everywhere in everyday life, but something as important in our country's democracy does not. I feel we need to change this due to the significance of that voting carries. That is why voter ID maintains integrity. Now that I have discussed the 3 reasons why we should require voter ID when we vote, I hope you take these facts into consideration and try to have an influence on the next election. Voters need special IDs to maintain voting integrity. When I first heard about the voting ID, I didn't care, but then I realized how important it was. By enforcing voter ID laws, we are ensuring the integrity of the ballot box, and after all, no one wants to be impersonated. You have to have an ID for everything else these days, buying cigarettes, alcohol, driving, in most cases, sometimes even buying CDs. To take corruption out of our election, we should all have to show a form of ID and be able to vote. I urge all of you to call your senators and voice your support for the voter ID. Also, please join me in voting for our next election and have your voter ID ready. Voter ID maintains integrity for 3 reasons. It helps eliminate immigrants from voting, prevents fraud, and makes the process easy and safe for voters.